This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, starts the show with a grain market outlook. He covers the recent prospective plantings and U.S. grain stocks reports. Keeping the show moving is K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre as she comments on the diseases that wheat growers should be keeping an eye out for in their fields. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show discussing the weather. Chip says if we can expect more moisture and what temperatures we are likely going to feel. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, we had some USDA reports come out on March 31st and wanting to talk through those today, and the first one being the prospective plantings report.
These reports come out as really the first shot over the bow of the markets with regard to at least planted acres. And from there, we make yield assumptions and production assumptions that follow from that. We try to assess how uncertain yields might be throughout the year. How likely is it that we'll hit what the USDA has said most recently, i.e. trendline yields or something else? And then we start to formulate our expectations for where at harvest we might be supply-demand balance and price-wise. So that's where these things come from. And in the prospective plantings report that came out, there were some unexpected numbers. We saw the U.S. corn planted acreage estimate come in at 95.326 million acres, and that was above average trade guesses by about 67 to 80,000 acres. So a little bit higher than expected. And there were some numbers coming into that. The highest estimates were 96.6, lowest 92.5. So we came in a little bit above average. And that number is up substantially from last year. Last year we planted in the U.S. about 90.6 million acres. So 95.3 versus 90.6. So you've got about a little over, if my math is right, about 4.7, near 4 million acres plus over last year's number. Again, 95.3 versus 90.6, and about a 5% gain, 5.2% increase. So, yeah, that happening for corn. It's notable also that for soybeans, and for as much as in the U.S. Corn Belt, we bounce back and forth between corn and soybean acres. Soybeans came in as a prospective plantings number, 83.5 million acres to be planted. We planted last year about 87.05. So we were down about 3.6 million acres, down 4%. That number was just slightly below, even less than what the market was expecting coming into that report at 83.7. So overall, corn went up about 5%, soybeans went down about 4%. Somewhat of a balance. There were some changes that I was kind of surprised by, and on the wheat side. All U.S. wheat came in at 45.35 million acres. The USDA's Ag Outlook Conference projected that at about 47 million. So we have even less than what we were thinking at the end of March. So we're down about, from pre-report estimates, about 1.125 million acres. Winter wheat, and that's where we're mainly focusing on. We're focusing on here in Kansas, 33.315 million acres, down from the pre-report estimates of 33.9, so about 650,000. So I guess what the surprise is that these numbers are a bit lower than what we were expecting coming out of the early January reports we had. We had a winter wheat and canola seedings report that came out, and so these numbers are even less than that. And other spring wheat came in a little bit lower than expected at 10.02 million acres, down about 500,000 acres than had been expected. A little bit higher Durham, about 11,000. I guess a crop that we focus on here in Kansas is grain sorghum. The grain sorghum numbers, last year we had about 6.3 million acres planted in the United States, came in at 6.6 million acres. So given the challenging price scenario that we've seen for sorghum, born primarily of this export-related issues having a lot to do with U.S. versus China and those contentions. So we came in with higher sorghum acres. And I guess it kind of motivates us to think about what some of those factors are. The lower cost of production in some areas of dryness, some advantages for non-irrigated grain sorghum there. So all in all, grain sorghum came in better than thought. The big loser acreage-wise was cotton. Cotton came in at expected U.S. plantings of 9.86, basically about 9.9 million acres. We were at 11.2 last year, so down almost 12%. The national canola numbers were down some, about 6 or 7% at 2.6 million acres. So that is as it was. What's really interesting for us, Shelby, is to compare that to what's happening in Kansas. In particular, you look at that canola figure. So whereas the canola acres in the U.S. were down about 6%, we were up about 17, 18% in Kansas. And of course, now we have some canola crushing facilities capacity in the state. So that's, I guess, if there's a place to take it, that gives surety to producers. So we've seen that. So that's something to watch. Cotton numbers in Kansas down about 100,000 acres, 1 million even projected. Sorghum up about 100,000 acres, up to 3.1 million, so about 1% higher. Sunflowers. Don't hear as much about sunflowers in the stages we had, but last year we were down to 10,500 acres, and this year came in at about 15. So I think a lot of what happened last year had to do with the closure of a crushing facility and uncertainty about market outlet. So that was in play. We don't talk a lot about hay. All hay in Kansas down actually about 80,000 acres this year. So there aren't many people out there with planters planting hay or new stands of hay, but overall we're down about 4% in terms of at least what we were measuring on March the 1st. Winter wheat from 7.6 last year down to 7.3. It's continuing kind of a sideways to lower trend. And again, the corn versus soybean issue was in play also here in Kansas. Here in the state, corn acres 6.4 million, up about 1.6%, and soybeans 4.3 million, down about 5%. So we were reflecting some of the change in corn versus soybeans, but some of the thunder perhaps of the corn acreage increase that we'd seen nationally was probably taken by sorghum coming in and taking some of those feed grain acres. So interesting to look at. I would say also for trade estimates that also we looked at quarterly stocks numbers. So not as much in play there. Out of that, I'm most interested in the usage numbers. So we get quarterly stocks as of March 1. What's that tell us for what happened during December, February through usage? So a little bit lower wheat usage than we thought was coming in, a little bit higher actually for corn, and I adjusted the old crop supply demand balance sheet that ends for the marketing year ending the 31st just to reflect that. For soybeans, a little bit lower usage than we'd expected. So these aren't major changes, but I guess when the stocks numbers adjust either higher or lower, and when you're as you come into the end of the current marketing year that you're in, it leads you then to adjust the beginning stocks for the next year. So that's kind of what we've looked at then. And I do, if we have time, I can take just a real quick review of how these acreage numbers may have affected our outlook for corn and soybeans, if you'd like.
Go for it.
Okay, we'll go forth to do it. For corn, again, instead of plugging in 94 million acres, you plug in 95.5, and you look at the USDA's projection of 181 bushels an acre. Suddenly, you're projecting about 15.8 billion bushels of corn in the U.S. Ending stocks jump up above 2 billion to about 2.1. You're up to about 14% stocks to use. But in my own thinking, that's a trend. We haven't come within at least one, almost 2 bushels per acre of that number. So it's probably more reasonable to think about, say, 178 bushels per acre. Then you're down to 15.5 billion, still a record high. If you And it's probably more like a 40% chance of that happening, maybe 30% of the USDA's projection. So my own thinking is that we're likely to get yields that are less than that. And if 181's probably placeholder for the high yield, then there's about a 70% chance of something less. And when you look at these acreage figures, though, it looks like this year it's going to be pretty surprising in the U.S. if we get anything below 15 billion bushels of production. We have that many acres. And if you crunch that thing down to 172 bushels an acre, you're still looking at, 15.0 even, basically, for production. So you got that. Now, on the soybeans, just to close here, on the other side of the coin, here we've cut back soybean acres down to looking at it, projection about 83.5 million acres and plugged in a high yield, 52.5 bushels an acre. Just taking that plus the changes in the supply demand balance sheet, you're suddenly in a situation where you have about 290 million bushels of soybeans instead of 380 or 320 as an ending stocks figure that we've seen recently. And if you have lower yields than that, then you're getting below finally or eventually, if you keep crunching yields down to say either 49.5 or 48, you're getting below 4 billion bushels of soybeans, getting stocks to use below 5%, and prices they'd be reactive to a tight situation like that. So I guess to bring it all together, for corn with the higher acres, it's going to be a bigger hurdle to jump to have any situation that really jumps prices higher. But for soybeans, as we've cut back acres now, any yield threat could probably bring a pretty reactive price response to the upside from just because now we've got a smaller base to work off of, and we'll see where it all goes.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with a wheat disease and virus outlook with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kelsey, today, wanting to begin talking about wheat streak mosaic virus, and why is it something we're chatting about today?
Yeah, so going into this spring, one thing that we've been mentioning is that this might be a good year to watch out for wheat streak mosaic virus. And this is a disease where infection can happen anytime, but we really don't start to see symptoms until the weather warms up and we move into these green up and jointing phases of wheat development. Oftentimes, symptoms can be confused with things like nitrogen deficiency or other nutrient deficiencies. But when you get into the wheat crop, you see very classic mosaic symptoms. We've already had positive samples in several counties of Kansas. We knew last year we were coming out of a year where we had pretty bad widespread wheat streak mosaic. So we have a couple signals that suggest that this could be another bad year. So this is just a timely reminder to go out, scout your field, especially if you know you had volunteer or neighbors had volunteer somewhere nearby, and that our diagnostic lab here at K-State does offer testing for all of the major wheat viruses.
What is the cause usually of the infection?
Yeah, so the cause is the wheat curl mite. So these are tiny, tiny mites. There's usually millions of them at the end of the wheat season, close to harvest. Their best case scenario is they'll move right into volunteer wheat that's sprouted pre-harvest, or they'll move into nearby volunteer wheat right after harvest. They'll survive there through the summer, and then they'll work their way into a fall planted crop. When we have that infection happen very early in the fall, that's when we typically see the most dramatic yield losses. When we're getting later into the season, into our later jointing or even flag leaf emergent phases, we're a little bit less worried about yield loss. But when we have those early infections, we can see pretty severe losses to this disease.
Is there anything growers can do about it?
Well, so all the major decisions have to happen pre-planting. So that's why we're, very careful to recommend controlling your volunteer wheat after harvest. You want to control it close to harvest and keep those fields clean after harvest. And then especially within 2 weeks of planting, that's a really critical period to control volunteer wheat. There are some varieties that offer a slightly better tolerance or resistance, but there are no perfect solutions. Once we have symptoms in the spring, there's really not much we can do. So we can test and then we can make some decisions about what we want to do with the crop going forward. But unfortunately, when we get to this stage of the season, there aren't any management practices we can take.
And something that doesn't overwinter in Kansas, so you're kind of keeping an eye on right now, stripe rust, and where does it overwinter?
Yeah, so stripe rust, that's another disease we're starting to think about for our wheat fields this time of year. Again, it doesn't survive here, so it gets killed off every year and works its way back to Texas, where it survives over the winter and will start to develop in the early spring. So we have had a couple of reports of stripe rust this year in Texas, right? That's the first place we're kind of looking because it needs to work its way up through Oklahoma to us here in Kansas. So there were reports, but the good news is that levels in Texas have been low, right? So lower than they were last year, for example. And there have not been any reports to date of stripe rust or leaf rust in Oklahoma or Kansas as of now. So this is good news in the sense that the later we get without reports in the state, the lower the chance of really widespread yield loss is, right? So as we're moving into the season, our risk lowers. The other good news is that weather really hasn't been favorable and isn't projected to be favorable in Texas, right? So that's another signal that disease levels are going to be low going into the season. So to summarize that, right, stripe rust doesn't survive here in Kansas, needs to work its way back up every year. This year, it is in Texas, but it's been reported later and at lower levels than in years when it's been more severe here. No reports yet in Oklahoma or Kansas of stripe rust, so that's another good signal. Here we are early April, right, with no reports, so that's another good signal. So all of those together, they signal that it might be a low stripe rust year. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to see any rust, right? So what happens over the next few weeks will be critical. We still need to scout. We still need to report when we find that disease. And then, of course, we need to watch the weather as we enter some of those critical periods for fungicide applications in any given location, right? There still is a chance we could have parts of Kansas that do experience stripe rust. So we'll just need to be very mindful over the next few weeks of scouting. And at K-State, we'll, of course, alert through Agronomy E updates and other sources when we detect stripe rust, and we'll map that as we do in most years.
What are the favorable weather conditions that help move it, unfortunately, up through the states?
Yeah, so we need periods of high relative humidity, right? So we need dew basically forming on wheat. So we need moisture. We haven't really had enough moisture here, as you've probably been hearing, Shelby, over the last couple of weeks. And then we also want weather that's cooler, right? So if it suddenly gets very hot, for example, those conditions wouldn't be that conducive for stripe rust development. So cool, wet weather is typically what we think of when we think of good stripe rust weather.
Anything growers can do for it?
Well, sure. Yeah. So the good news is we do have tools in the box for stripe rust management. At this point in the season, fungicides are our best option, right? So pre-planting, we can select varieties. So a good thing to do now would just be to double check what variety that you have planted. So you can look back on the K-State wheat variety guide. And if your variety rates 3 or below for stripe rust, you probably don't need to worry about a fungicide application. But if you have a more susceptible variety rated 4 or above, or, especially if it's rated a 6, 7, or 8, right, you probably do want to, start to at least scout those fields and consider fungicide applications if, again, stripe rust makes it up into the state at higher levels. So we do have a newly released wheat fungicide efficacy guide that can be referenced to find products that work very well for stripe rust. Luckily, we have several products available on the market that control that disease very well. We release this every year. Actually, it's a summary of multi-state data, so a lot of people are involved in summarizing and publishing this data every year. And this year we've added 2 new products to the table, Adastrio and Top Guard. These are products available for wheat producers in Kansas. And as a reminder, in that document, you can typically find the fungicide product's name. Sometimes we have one product name, but we'll have a note if we have generic products for that specific chemistry available in Kansas. And then you'll also see how that product rates for multiple diseases that you can find here in Kansas, right? So something might be a very good product or excellent product for stripe rust control, but it wouldn't work for fusarium head blight, or it would have poor control or not be labeled for fusarium head blight scab. So again, it's just something to think about. We want to make sure we're using the best product for the disease that we're trying to control. We also remind producers about pre-harvest intervals on that document, right? So fungicides have a kind of an end point of when they can be applied to wheat that's being harvested for grain. So it's important to double check some of those label restrictions, and we try to summarize those along with rates in that document.
Kelsey, anything else that maybe wheat growers should be looking out for in their fields?
Well, this is the time that we're scouting for all the major diseases. So stripe rust, leaf rust. If you're in wheat after wheat rotations, it's time to look for those leaf spotting diseases, septoria, tan spot, staganospora. We start to see them move up from the residue, and of course the viruses that we start to see this time of year. So, I think scouting is key, checking on the crop, and we can do that when we're out making our herbicide or our early spring fertility applications, right? It's a good time to do some scouting for disease and come up with a plan.
If people want to find out more information on these diseases or the Efficacy Guide, how can they do that?
Well, you can check out the K-State bookstore. So we do have a K-State Research and Extension bookstore where these publications can be downloaded. You could also reach out to your local K-State Research and Extension office. Your local extension agent will have the most up-to-date information on the topics I covered here.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. You can check out the Foliar fungicide efficacy ratings for wheat disease management 2025 publication by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it in the K-State Research and Extension bookstore, which is bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. This pub is EP130. You can also read more on stripe rust by looking up an Agronomy E-Update article titled Outlook for Stripe Rust in the 2025 Kansas Wheat Crop is Optimistic, which I will also link in today's show notes. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with the weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, this past week we've seen some active weather, and where was that and what was it?
Yeah, so we had a lot of wind this month so far, and we had some pretty impactful storm systems and even some snow. But we finally start to see the warm season, severe weather, part of active weather. And we haven't seen a lot of that. In fact, severe weather-wise in the state, we're below normal. We had a line of storms develop basically from Ellsworth, even down into Barton County, and north and east to about Nemaha, Brown County. And those storms kind of trained over that same area, just storm after storm, following that same path. And we had a corridor of about 3 to 5 inches of rainfall. That was only about 10, 15 miles wide in the heaviest, most intense areas. And that resulted in some flash flooding and also resulted in some severe weather with it. We had some hail that accumulated in several places, and we also saw some strong winds. There were reports of tornadoes in the Salina, Kannapolis Lake area, but I don't think they really happened. There was a lot of scary-looking clouds out there. They didn't find any damage, so I don't think they were very realistic reports. But overall, we're still below average for severe weather. As the storms moved off to the east, they did produce a little bit more hail and wind. A lot of the central and east saw precipitation. Granted, they didn't get that corridor of heaviest rain, but a lot of people saw about their average precipitation for the week. And in central Kansas, that's around 1/2 to 6/10 of an inch. You get out west, you get about 3/10 of an inch, and you get out east, you're looking at about almost an inch. And so we needed that rainfall. The drought monitor cutoff is Tuesday morning. And so the precipitation that we observed was Tuesday night. So it didn't get included in this week's drought monitor. So we actually saw an increase in moderate drought, quite a bit increase in moderate drought in central Kansas on the drought monitor this week. We were drying out. We needed that moisture. Now we got some. There were still some losers. Southwest Kansas missed out. North Central also missed out on precipitation. And therefore, there's still areas of the state that need it. But hopefully, as you go through the day today, which is Friday, we can get more widespread moisture. We've got a wave of precipitation that is expected to go across a majority of the state. The one area that might miss out the most is maybe North Central might, but everywhere else should see measurable precipitation anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch, potentially higher, especially in the southeast, which is climatologically normal, and much needed rainfall. And that it's moving green up along. Things have rapidly greened up where there has been precipitation, leaf outs occurring now on the trees. And so we're going to need more moisture to keep up with that as we go into spring.
Any concern for freeze this weekend?
Yeah, so when this system moves out on Saturday, finally dry out a little bit, it's about 3 days of just overcast, dreary weather, and temperatures below normal. We're going to have an even colder air mass come in behind it on Saturday night, and that should set the stage for a pretty widespread freeze and frost, at least, for the state going into Sunday morning. It's still a little early in that freeze-frost season, where our average is around like April 20th if you average the whole state. So the Southeast obviously has their last freeze earlier than the Northwest. So we're not quite in that window of big concern, but we've had enough heat. And now that we're getting that moisture, vegetation is moving along a little bit further than normal, or advanced further than it would be typically this time of year. So I definitely could see some potential kill, or at least injury at the very least. The wheat should mostly be able to handle this kind of cold. We haven't progressed it enough. But some of the things like perennials people have planted or annuals, some people got pretty excited about those warmer temperatures. And we had soil temperatures exceeding 50 degrees, so things were growing. But overall, as you go into Sunday afternoon, I think things will warm up. And really early next week is cool, below normal. Our average temperatures in the low 60s for highs. We'll be a little bit below that Monday and Tuesday. And then we start to warm up pretty quickly Wednesday through the rest of the week, with temperatures potentially in the 70s to maybe even 80s by the end of next week. And precipitation-wise, is dry air mass in place. I don't expect any big moisture makers, so no precipitation across the state really for the next 7 days.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.